On a Tuesday morning in March, a 29-year-old marketing coordinator named Ashley Bennett sat outside a federal courtroom in a blazer she'd bought 2 days earlier because none of her real clothes felt like they belonged to the woman she'd become. She was not on trial, not officially, but federal investigators wanted to know one thing, and they wanted to know it under oath. Was she her boss's wife, his accomplice, or his last victim? 4 months earlier, she couldn't have told you the difference either. She'd woken up in a hotel room in Nevada with a headache, a stranger's cufflink on the nightstand, and a marriage certificate with her name on it. The man she'd married was her boss, and within 90 days, he would be declared missing, presumed dead, and $41 million would vanish with him. This is the story of how one night in Reno turned an ordinary employee into the prime suspect in one of the strangest fraud cases the FBI had worked in a decade. We'll get to the courtroom. We'll get to the money, but first, you need to understand who Daniel Stone really was, because almost nobody did. To understand how a marriage could become a murder investigation, you have to understand the company where it started. Stone Capital Ventures was a mid-sized private investment firm, the kind of place with exposed brick, espresso machine nobody knew how to use, and a CEO who made every employee feel like they mattered. That CEO was Daniel Stone. 38 years old, self-made, or so the story went. Charismatic in the specific way that makes people forget to ask follow-up questions. This case would eventually raise 3 questions that investigators, and Ashley herself, spent over a year trying to answer. First, was the Reno marriage really an accident, or was Ashley chosen for a reason she didn't understand until much later? Second, where did the $41 million actually go? And third, the question that would end up matter most in that courtroom, was Daniel Stone really dead? Investigators would later say this case had more false endings than any file they'd worked. Every time they thought they'd found the truth, it moved. So let's start where the story actually starts. Not in Reno, but 18 months earlier, the day Ashley Bennett got the job that would change her life, for reasons that had nothing to do with her resume. Ashley Bennett grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 3, the kind of kid who organized her siblings' birthday parties before she was old enough to drive. She studied communications at Ohio State, worked 2 internships nobody remembers the names of, and moved to the city with $400 and a duffel bag, chasing the version of adulthood she'd seen in movies. When she interviewed at Stone Capital Ventures, she wasn't looking for a fairy tale. She was looking for health insurance. The woman who hired her was Mary Gabriel, Stone Capital's chief operating officer, and on paper, Daniel Stone's business partner of 9 years. Mary was the one people actually trusted. Where Daniel charmed, Mary calculated. She'd built the firm's back office from nothing, and employees joked that if Daniel was the face of Stone Capital, Mary was its skeleton, the thing holding everything upright. Nobody joked that Mary and Daniel had once been engaged. Almost nobody knew. Ashley started as a marketing coordinator. Within 6 months, she was managing investor relations events, the glossy dinners where Daniel charmed retirees into rolling their pensions into Stone Capital funds. She was good at her job. She was better at reading rooms. And slowly, without ever meaning to, she became someone Daniel Stone leaned on, to remember names, to smooth over an awkward toast, to notice when a client's smile didn't reach their eyes. Co-workers would later describe the relationship as close, but not like that. Ashley herself insisted, both to friends and eventually to federal investigators, that there was no romance, that Daniel was magnetic to everyone, and she was simply one more person caught in the pull of it. Her best friend Jenna remembers it differently. She remembers Ashley coming home from work dinners, lit up in a way that had nothing to do with the wine. Then came the annual company retreat, 3 days in Reno, ostensibly a strategy summit, in practice, an excuse to drink good scotch on the company card. Daniel Stone was, by every account, at his best that weekend. Warm, funny, generous with compliments that landed exactly where they were aimed. He toasted the team's best year yet. He meant every word of it. Or he was good enough at his job that it didn't matter whether he did. What almost nobody at that retreat knew, what wouldn't come out until much later, was that Stone Capital Ventures was not having its best year. Behind the numbers Daniel presented to investors auditors would eventually find a very different set of books. Money moving in circles. New investor funds paying off old investor returns. The kind of structure that has a name federal prosecutors use a lot. A Ponzi scheme. But that weekend, nobody knew to look for it. On the second night of the retreat, after the strategy sessions ended and the open bar opened wider, a small group, Daniel, Mary, Ashley, and 2 junior analysts, decided to take the party off the hotel property. Someone suggested a casino downtown. Someone else suggested the 24-hour wedding chapel 2 blocks from it, as a joke. Nobody who was there that night agrees, entirely, on whose idea it actually was. Here's where the accounts start to diverge, and where this story starts to earn its name. Ashley's memory of that night is fragmented. Gaps where the champagne and the casino floor and something stronger blur together. Mary Gabriel's memory, when she was eventually deposed, was described by one attorney as suspiciously complete. And Daniel Stone's account of that night, well, we'll get to whether Daniel Stone ever gave an account of anything again. What we know for certain is this. At 1:47 a.m., a marriage license was issued at the Washoe County Clerk's office to Daniel Robert Stone and Ashley Marie Bennett. At 2:15 a.m., a small wedding chapel on Virginia Street processed a ceremony lasting under 6 minutes. And at some point before sunrise, both of them signed a marriage certificate that neither of them, by their own later accounts, remembered signing clearly enough to describe. Ashley woke up first. Her head was pounding. Her mouth was dry in the specific way that comes from mixing drinks she couldn't remember ordering. And on the nightstand, next to her phone, was a small square of paper folded in half. She almost didn't open it. When she did, the first thing she registered wasn't the words. It was her own handwriting on the signature line, looser than usual, but unmistakably hers. Daniel woke up 20 minutes later, in the same bed, still fully dressed except for one shoe. Ashley remembers holding the certificate up without saying anything, watching his face cycle through confusion, then something that looked almost like amusement. Before landing, she was certain of this part, on something closer to calculation. He laughed first. "Well," he said, "that's a story for the office. It wasn't funny for long. Nevada doesn't require a waiting period for marriage, and it doesn't undo one easily either. An annulment requires proving specific legal grounds, fraud, incapacity, bigamy, and simply not remembering the ceremony isn't automatically one of them, especially when 2 witnesses and a licensed officiant are prepared to testify that both parties appeared, in the moment, coherent, willing, and by some accounts, quote, very happy. Daniel suggested they simply not tell anyone and file for annulment quietly the following week. Ashley agreed. What else was she going to do? He was her boss. He was, as of roughly 6 hours earlier, also her husband. Neither of those facts came with an instruction manual. She flew home Sunday night, convinced this would be a strange story she'd tell at parties in 5 years. Once enough time had passed for it to be funny. It wasn't the marriage that made this a true crime story. Plenty of impulsive Reno weddings get quietly erased and never make headlines. What made this one different is what happened over the following 11 weeks. Weeks in which the annulment paperwork mysteriously kept stalling, in which Daniel kept finding reasons to delay signing, and in which, unbeknownst to Ashley, someone inside Stone Capital Ventures was moving money out of client accounts faster than at any point in the firm's history. By early February, 3 of Stone Capital's largest investors, 2 retired teachers and a small manufacturing pension fund, submitted routine requests to withdraw a portion of their holdings. Routine requests that, at a healthy firm, take days. At Stone Capital, they took weeks, then months, accompanied by increasingly elaborate explanations from Daniel about market conditions, liquidity windows, and paperwork delays that made sense individually and, taken together, made no sense at all. Ashley noticed something was wrong before she understood what it meant. Daniel had started closing his office door during calls he used to take with it open. He'd started asking her to reschedule investor dinners he'd never canceled in 3 years. And on a Thursday afternoon in late February, she walked past his office and heard him say 4 words through the door that she would replay in her head for the rest of the year. "We can't cover March." She told herself it was about a marketing budget. She told herself a lot of things that spring. But 3 days later, on a Sunday, Daniel Stone didn't show up for a scheduled Monday morning investor call, the first meeting he'd ever missed in the company's history. His phone went straight to voicemail. His car was found, locked, in the long-term parking lot of a regional airport 90 minutes from the office. And Mary Gabriel, when Ashley called her in a panic, said something that Ashley would repeat to investigators word for word months later. Mary said, "I think he's gone, Ashley, and I think you need to call a lawyer before you call the police." Within 72 hours, 3 federal agencies had opened files on Stone Capital Ventures. And Ashley Bennett, marketing coordinator, employee of the year runner-up, and, as of a Reno wedding chapel 11 weeks earlier, legal spouse of the company's missing CEO, was no longer just an employee caught in the wreckage. Under Nevada community property law, she was, on paper, potentially entitled to half of everything Daniel Stone owned, and potentially liable for everything he owed. The case landed on the desk of Detective Stella Austin, a 14-year veteran who'd spent the last 6 working white-collar fraud alongside financial crimes units. Stella had seen executives disappear before. Usually, she said later, it meant one of 2 things. The person was dead, or the person very much wanted everyone to think so. Her job, in the first 96 hours, was to figure out which. Stella's first move was to pull Daniel Stone's financial records, and what she found didn't look like a man in a hurry. In the 6 weeks before he disappeared, Daniel had liquidated 2 retirement accounts, transferred ownership of a lake house to an LLC registered in Delaware, and taken out a life insurance policy with a death benefit of $6 million, with a beneficiary designation that had been quietly changed 9 days before he vanished. The new beneficiary wasn't Mary Gabriel, his business partner and former fiancée. It wasn't a parent or a sibling. It was Ashley Bennett, the marketing coordinator he'd married in Reno 11 weeks earlier, and never told about the change. When Stella Austin showed her the paperwork in an interview room, Ashley says she read the beneficiary line 4 times before the words made sense, and then didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "Why would he do that?" Ashley finally asked. Stella's answer, delivered flatly, is the kind of line that ends up in every version of this story since. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Either he loved you more than anyone at that company realized, or you were the only person left he hadn't already used up." Ashley wouldn't know which one was closer to the truth for another 5 months. While Stella's team worked the financial trail, the FBI's forensic accountants worked the fund itself, and the picture that emerged was worse than anyone at Stone Capital had imagined. Of the roughly $90 million under management, over $41 million couldn't be traced to any legitimate investment. Some had gone to fake shell entities. Some had funded Daniel's own lifestyle, the lake house, a boat, a second condo none of his coworkers knew existed, and a portion, a stubborn, unaccounted-for portion, simply disappeared from the paper trail entirely, routed through an offshore account that closed itself out 9 days before Daniel vanished. Investigators floated 3 working theories. 1, Daniel had staged his own disappearance to escape prosecution, taking the missing funds with him. 2, Daniel had been the target of foul play, silenced by an investor, a partner, or someone else who stood to lose everything if the fraud came to light. 3, and this was the theory Stella Austin kept circling back to, against her better instincts, that both were somehow true, and that the 2 people who knew the most, Ashley and Mary, weren't telling her the whole story. For Ashley, the weeks after Daniel's disappearance were a slow unraveling of everything she thought she understood about her job, her marriage, and her own judgment. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Her face appeared in a business magazine spread under the headline, "The Bride of the Ponzi King," a phrase she says still makes her physically flinch. Old coworkers stopped returning her calls. And every few days, a new detail from the investigation would surface that made her question something she'd taken for granted for a year and a half. The most unsettling detail came 6 weeks in, when investigators pulled hotel security footage from that night in Reno. Footage the chapel had kept as a matter of routine liability insurance. It showed Daniel Stone at 11:40 p.m., alone, on a hallway payphone outside the casino floor, 40 minutes before he rejoined the group, and the idea of a wedding chapel supposedly came up as a joke. Nobody could identify who he'd called. The number traced to a burner phone that had never been used again. It was a small detail. It was also the first piece of hard evidence suggesting that whatever happened in Reno that night might not have been the accident everyone, including Ashley, had assumed. Stella Austin flagged it, filed it, and moved on to the next lead, the way detectives do with 100 small anomalies that might mean everything or nothing. She wouldn't understand what that phone call meant until the case had already blown apart in an entirely different direction. Meanwhile, Mary Gabriel had become, in Stella's words, the most cooperative person in this entire case, which is exactly what worries me. Mary handed over financial records without being asked twice. She sat for 4 separate interviews. She even helped investigators locate 2 shell accounts nobody else had found. On paper, she was the model witness. But Stella Austin had spent 14 years learning that the most cooperative person in the room is sometimes cooperative for a reason that has nothing to do with innocence. 3 months into the investigation, with no body, no confirmed sighting of Daniel Stone, and a growing pile of financial contradictions, the case hit a wall. Forensic teams had exhausted the paper trail. The FBI had issued an international alert. And Ashley Bennett, legally married, functionally widowed, financially entangled in a fraud she swore she knew nothing about, was told by her own attorney that without a body or a confession, this case might simply stay open forever, an unanswered question with her name permanently attached to it. And then, in the second week of June, a fishing guide on a remote stretch of the Colorado River found something that would reopen the case entirely and hand investigators a truth stranger than anything they'd theorized. What the fishing guide found, wedged against a fallen tree 11 miles downstream from a state park boat launch, was a body, badly decomposed, in the water an estimated 8 to 10 weeks, wearing a watch that dental records and a serial number would later confirm belonged to Daniel Stone. For a moment, the entire case seemed to resolve itself. Daniel Stone was dead. The question of whether he'd staged his disappearance was, apparently, answered. He hadn't run. He'd drowned, or been drowned, sometime in the weeks after he vanished. Investigators closed the missing persons portion of the case and opened a homicide file instead. The medical examiner's report was inconclusive on cause of death. The body had been in the water too long to determine much beyond the presence of a skull fracture that could have come from a fall, a blow, or simply the river itself, over 10 weeks, against rock. It was enough, though, for Stella Austin to start looking at Daniel Stone's death as something someone did to him, rather than something he did to himself. Which is where the second call came in, the one that changed everything. 3 weeks after the body's identification, an anonymous tip reached the FBI's Financial Crimes Hotline, directing agents to a storage unit 40 minutes outside the city, rented 8 months earlier, under a name nobody at Stone Capital recognized, Robert Daniels. Note the pattern. A near mirror of Daniel Robert Stone's own name, flipped like a signature written by someone who wanted, on some level, to be found eventually. Inside were 2 suitcases, $12,000 in cash, a passport under the name Robert Daniels with Daniel Stone's photo on it, and a burner phone with exactly 1 saved contact. The saved contact was Mary Gabriel's cell phone number, the same one on file at Stone Capital Ventures. And the phone's call log, which the burner's carrier had retained despite the device never being used, showed a single 4-minute call placed at 11:40 p.m. on a night in Reno to a number that matched exactly the payphone Daniel Stone had used, alone, 40 minutes before his wedding, to Ashley Bennett, had supposedly been a spontaneous idea. Here's what investigators eventually pieced together, and what a federal indictment would later lay out in detail. Daniel Stone's fraud hadn't been improvised in a panic. It had been planned for over a year, with Mary Gabriel's full knowledge, and by some accounts, her direct participation. As co-founder, Mary had access to the same accounts, the same client relationships, the same $41 million slowly being siphoned out through shell entities she'd helped structure herself, using expertise from 9 years running the firm's back office. The plan, prosecutors would later argue, was for Daniel to disappear entirely, fake his death using a body double, source through a network prosecutors are still trying to fully map, assume the identity of Robert Daniels, and meet Mary somewhere outside the country with the missing millions, leaving behind a company collapse that would take years to fully untangle. The Reno marriage to Ashley, wasn't the accident it appeared to be. According to phone records and a financial trail investigators built piece by piece, it was Mary's idea. Marrying an employee with no independent knowledge of the fraud, someone whose name meant nothing to regulators, gave Daniel a legal spouse positioned to inherit assets, receive insurance payouts, and absorb scrutiny that would otherwise fall on Mary Gabriel, his real, long-term partner, in every sense but the legal one. Ashley wasn't chosen because Daniel loved her. She was chosen because she didn't know enough to be a threat, and because a grieving, bewildered, accidental wife made a far more sympathetic face for federal investigators than a business partner of 9 years. That's the moment this case stops being a story about a wedding gone wrong and becomes a story about how easily a person can be used as a piece on someone else's board without ever being told the game had started. Ashley Bennett had spent 5 months being investigated as a possible accomplice. She had, in fact, been the plan's most important unwitting asset and its most disposable one. But if Mary and Daniel had built this plan together, why was Mary Gabriel still in the city, cooperating with investigators, 4 months after Daniel Stone was supposed to have disappeared with her, $41 million richer, into a life neither of them would ever have to explain? That question, the one Stella Austin had been circling since the first interview, was about to get an answer nobody on the investigative team had predicted. Confronted with the phone records, the storage unit, and the alias, Mary Gabriel did something none of the investigators expected. She stopped being cooperative in the careful, curated way she'd been for 5 months, and she started talking, in the specific, unguarded way people talk when they've finally run out of reasons to protect someone else. Mary confirmed the plan, mostly as investigators had reconstructed it. She and Daniel had been quietly rebuilding their relationship for 2 years, hidden from a firm that would never have tolerated a romantic entanglement between its 2 most senior executives. She confirmed the marriage to Ashley had been her suggestion, and that she'd felt, at the time, almost nothing about using a 29-year-old employee as legal cover. Ashley was, in Mary's words during that interview, collateral damage in a plan that was never supposed to touch her for more than a few months. But the body in the river, Mary insisted, was never part of the plan. The body double was supposed to be someone else entirely, arranged through a contact Daniel had cultivated for over a year, someone with no living family who wouldn't be searched for. Mary claims that 2 days before Daniel was supposed to disappear using that body, he changed the plan without telling her, and disappeared for real, alone, with the entire $41 million, leaving her behind to face an investigation she'd helped build the foundation for. If that's true, and investigators, cautiously, came to believe most of it was, then the body pulled from the Colorado River 11 weeks earlier wasn't a body double at all. It was Daniel Stone himself. Not staged, not planned. A man who built an elaborate scheme to vanish with a fortune and never got the chance to spend $1 of it, found by a fishing guide who had no idea he was closing one of the strangest fraud cases in the region's history. The medical examiner's inconclusive skull fracture, the one that could have been a fall or a blow, was never fully resolved. Investigators ultimately couldn't prove whether Daniel died accidentally while fleeing alone through unfamiliar terrain, or whether someone else, an investor who'd lost everything, a partner he'd betrayed one time too many, or someone still unidentified, found him first. That question remains, officially, open. The case file lists Daniel Stone's cause of death as undetermined. Prosecutors declined to pursue a homicide charge against Mary Gabriel, citing insufficient evidence connecting her directly to his death. What prosecutors could prove, and did, was fraud. Mary Gabriel pleaded guilty to securities fraud and conspiracy charges 8 months after that interrogation room confession, and was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Of the $41 million that vanished from Stone Capital Ventures, investigators recovered just under $6 million, mostly from the shell accounts Mary had helped construct, and ironically, later helped investigators unwind. The rest is presumed lost in accounts still untraced, or spent by a man who never lived long enough to enjoy it. And Ashley Bennett, the accidental bride, the accidental widow, the woman whose name appeared in headlines she never asked for, was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. Investigators found no evidence she knew about the fraud, the fake identity, or the plan that had used her marriage as a legal shield. She did, eventually, receive a portion of the $6 million life insurance policy. Not the full payout, since insurers challenged claims tied to a policyholder involved in active fraud, but a negotiated settlement that Ashley describes, quietly, as the strangest inheritance a person could ask for. She left the financial industry entirely. She still, occasionally, gets recognized, usually by strangers, who remember the headline more than the outcome. And she still, by her own account, has trouble trusting rooms full of confident, charming people, because the most convincing person she ever met turned out to be someone who saw her not as a partner, or even really as a person, but as a legal instrument, chosen for exactly the reasons that made her easy to overlook. Which raises the question this case leaves behind, unresolved in any court filing. How many people, in how many rooms, are quietly being used as pieces in a plan they were never told they'd joined? And how would any of us know until the moment the plan collapsed around us? Ashley Bennett didn't do anything wrong. She trusted a boss who turned out to be building an exit plan with her name on the paperwork, and a colleague who described her, on the record, as collateral damage. If there's a thread running through this whole case, it's not really about money, or even about the marriage. It's about how much of trust is just proximity, how easily we hand it to the people closest to us, without ever checking whether they've earned it. We still don't fully know what happened to Daniel Stone in his final hours, alone on that riverbank, or in the water that carried him 11 miles before anyone found him. Maybe we never will. That's the part of this story that still keeps investigators up at night. Not the fraud, which was, in the end, fairly ordinary. It's the ending nobody planned for, least of all the man who thought he'd planned for everything. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If you found out tomorrow that someone you trusted completely had spent 2 years quietly setting you up to take the fall for something you didn't even know existed, would you have seen it coming? Or would you have missed it, the same way Ashley did, right up until the moment it was too late to matter? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe, because we've got another case coming next week that starts with a missing wedding ring and ends somewhere nobody expected.